The alarm system screamed across the United Earth Defense Station as Captain Dae-ho Kim rushed onto the command bridge. His crew moved frantically at their stations, their faces pale with shock. Through the massive viewing window, space itself seemed to tear open as hundreds of enormous ships emerged from hyperspace. The vessels were unlike anything humanity had ever built. Their dark hulls covered in strange symbols that seemed to pulse with threatening light. Dae-ho had been a military officer for 15 years, but nothing in his training prepared him for this moment. The alien fleet stretched as far as his sensors could detect. His tactical officer reported 5,000 ships, each one larger and more powerful than Earth's strongest warship. Humanity had only recently achieved faster-than-light travel, and their 800 military vessels seemed pathetic compared to this massive force. The largest alien ship moved forward, dwarfing the defense station. A communication request came through, and Dae-ho had no choice but to accept. Within minutes, a diplomatic shuttle was approaching the station, and Earth's leaders were being summoned for an emergency meeting. Ambassador Hana Park arrived first, followed quickly by General Tae-sung Lee. Both looked grim as they prepared to meet the visitors. The aliens called themselves the Vrathan Collective. Their emissary, High Commander Vex Rith, was a towering figure with dark blue skin and forearms. His eyes were cold as he studied the humans gathered in the conference room. He spoke through a translation device, his voice deep and filled with absolute certainty. He had delivered this same speech to 73 other species across the galaxy, and every single one had eventually submitted. Vex Rith explained that the Vrathan Collective ruled over a third of the known galaxy. They had conquered countless worlds and absorbed hundreds of civilizations into their empire. Resistance was pointless. Defiance was suicide. Humanity had 3 options, but really only one choice. They could surrender immediately and become a vassal state. They could refuse and be destroyed. Or they could fight and be destroyed more slowly. Hana listened carefully, her face calm, despite the fear coursing through her veins. She had spent her entire career negotiating treaties and resolving conflicts between Earth's nations. But this was different. This was not a negotiation between equals. This was a predator explaining to its prey exactly how it would be consumed. The terms were brutal. Humanity would dismantle all military forces. Earth and its colonies would surrender sovereignty to Vrathan authority. Human technology would be seized and studied. The population would be cataloged and assigned work duties based on Vrathan needs. Humanity would have no voice in their own future. They would exist only as servants to a greater power. General Tae-sung interrupted, asking what would happen if humanity refused. Vex Rith smiled, and the expression was not pleasant. He activated a holographic display, showing world after world being bombarded from orbit. Cities turned to ash. Oceans boiled away. Entire civilizations erased in hours. These were the species that had chosen defiance. These were the examples that taught others to submit. Hana asked about peaceful coexistence. Could humanity not remain independent while maintaining friendly relations with the collective? Vex Rith laughed at the suggestion. The Vrathan did not have allies. They had subjects and enemies. There was no middle ground. Species either bowed or burned. The meeting continued for 3 hours. Hana tried every diplomatic approach she knew. She offered trade agreements, technology exchanges, cultural partnerships. Vex Rith rejected everything. He showed footage of the Vrathan military in action. Their weapons could crack planets. Their soldiers were genetically engineered for combat. Their ships moved faster and hit harder than anything humanity could produce. The message was clear. Resistance meant extinction. Dae-ho watched the proceedings from the command bridge, his fists clenched. He had family on Earth. His parents lived in Seoul. His sister taught at a university in New Bizan Colony. The thought of them living under alien occupation made his stomach turn. But the thought of them dying in an orbital bombardment was infinitely worse. The Vrathan gave humanity 72 hours to decide. Their fleet would remain in position around Mars, a constant reminder of the power arrayed against Earth. Vexrith returned to his ship, confident that humanity would make the only logical choice. Every species eventually understood that survival required submission. As soon as the Vrathan departed, emergency sessions began on Earth. The United Earth Council gathered in Geneva. President Ji Woo Choi called every national leader, every military commander, every scientist who might offer a solution. The debate raged for hours. Some argued for surrender. Better to live as vassals than die as free people. Others demanded resistance regardless of cost. Freedom was worth any price. General Taesung presented the military analysis. It was devastating. Earth's fleet could not win a direct engagement. The technological gap was too wide. The numerical advantage too great. Even if every human ship fought perfectly, they would be overwhelmed in hours. Planetary defenses might delay the inevitable, but could not prevent it. From a pure military standpoint, resistance meant death, but Hannah spoke about what surrender meant. She had studied the records Vexrith provided. Vassal species had no rights. Their children were taken and raised as Vrathan citizens. Their resources were stripped away. Their cultures were slowly erased. Submission did not mean survival. It meant a slower death, stretched across generations until nothing human remained. The vote came down to a single question. Would humanity rather die free or live in chains? President Ji Woo called for a global referendum. Every human citizen would vote on their species' future. The results came in quickly. 78% chose resistance. They knew it meant war. They knew it meant death. But they chose it anyway. Ji Woo addressed the planet from the UN headquarters. Her speech was broadcast to every human settlement from Earth to the furthest colonies. She spoke simply and clearly. Humanity would not surrender. They would not submit. They would fight for their freedom with everything they had. If they were to die, they would die standing. The reaction across human space was immediate. Military personnel reported for duty. Civilians volunteered for defense forces. Scientists worked around the clock on new weapons. Factory workers increased production. Children too young to fight wrote letters to soldiers. The elderly who remembered Earth's wars shared lessons from history. Humanity had fought among themselves for thousands of years. Now they would fight as one species against a common enemy. Daeho prepared his station for combat. He knew his ships were outmatched. He knew many of his crew would not survive the coming battle. But as he looked at Earth through the viewing window, he felt something stronger than fear. He felt determination. The Vrathan had conquered 73 species, but they had never faced humanity before. The 72 hours passed. The Vrathan fleet began to move, and humanity prepared to show the galaxy what humans did when someone demanded their surrender. Admiral Yun Li stood on the bridge of the U.E.'s Indomitable, watching the Vrathan fleet advance toward Earth. Her 800 ships were positioned in a defensive sphere around the moon, waiting for the enemy to come within range. Every captain knew the odds. Every crew member understood this might be their last day alive. But none of them showed fear. They showed only grim determination. Yeon had spent the last 3 days planning this battle. She could not win through superior firepower. The Vrathan had that advantage. She could not win through better technology. The aliens had centuries of advancement over humanity. But she could win through unpredictability. The Vrathan had fought 73 species, and every one of them had fought conventionally. Humanity would not. The Vrathan formation was textbook military doctrine. Heavy battleships at the front to absorb damage. Cruisers in the middle for fire support. Carriers at the rear, launching fighter craft. It was efficient and proven. High Commander Vex Rith had used this formation 1,000 times. He expected the humans to meet him ship to ship, where his overwhelming numbers would crush them. He did not expect what actually happened. Captain Daiho commanded a squadron of 30 stealth fighters positioned behind lunar craters. They had been hiding there for hours, their engines cold, their signatures minimal. When the Vrathan fleet passed the moon, Daiho gave the signal. 30 ships erupted from concealment and struck at the Vrathan rear, targeting the carriers with precision missiles. The Vrathan were caught completely off guard. Their shields were facing forward to meet the expected frontal assault. Their point defense systems were calibrated for conventional attack vectors. Daiho's squadron moved too fast and too close for the carriers to respond effectively. Within minutes, 5 Vrathan carriers were crippled or destroyed, their fighter complements still on the launch decks. Vex Rith immediately ordered his fleet to turn and eliminate the human attackers. But this was exactly what Eon wanted. As the Vrathan formation broke apart to chase Daiho's squadron, the main human fleet attacked from 3 directions simultaneously. Eon had divided her forces into mobile strike groups that could move independently and strike from unexpected angles. Engineer Su Bin Han coordinated the drone swarms from her position on the Indomitable. Thousands of small autonomous drones poured from human ships, each one carrying explosives and guided by basic artificial intelligence. The Vrathan shields could stop large projectiles easily, but the drones were small and numerous. They swarmed over Vrathan ships like angry insects, attaching to hull sections and detonating in sequence. Individual drones did little damage, but hundreds hitting the same spot could breach even Vrathan armor. Weapons specialist Minji Kyo unleashed humanity's experimental raildens. These were massive weapons that used electromagnetic acceleration to fire projectiles at incredible speeds. They consumed enormous amounts of power and took minutes to recharge, but when they hit hard. Minji targeted wounded Vrathan ships, punching through weakened shields and devastating internal systems. Each shot cost a fortune in energy, but each shot removed an enemy vessel from the battle. The Vrathan responded with overwhelming firepower. Their energy weapons carved through human ships like paper. A single Vrathan battleship could destroy 3 human cruisers in the time it took to aim and fire. The space around Earth filled with debris and bodies as ships on both sides died in brilliant explosions. Captain Daiho's squadron took heavy losses. His fighters were fast, but they were fragile. Vrathan point defense systems adapted to the threat, shooting down human ships with increasing efficiency. Daiho watched half his squadron die in the first 30 minutes. But they had accomplished their mission. The Vrathan formation was broken. The carriers were burning. The enemy was fighting in chaos instead of ordered ranks. Eon pressed her advantage. She ordered all strike groups to focus fire on damaged Vrathan ships. Rather than spread their attacks across the entire enemy fleet, humans concentrated on eliminating wounded vessels. It was brutal mathematics. Better to destroy 100 ships completely than damage 500 ships partially. The battle became a swirling melee. Vrathan ships were more powerful, but human ships were more maneuverable. Human captains used the debris field as cover, hiding behind destroyed vessels and ambushing Vrathan ships that came too close. It was not honorable warfare. It was survival warfare. Vex Rith watched in growing fury as his fleet suffered losses he had never anticipated. These humans fought like animals, with no regard for military tradition or combat honor. They struck from behind. They used suicide tactics. They sacrificed their own ships to damage his. This was not how civilized species conducted war, but it was working. After 3 hours of combat, The Vrathan had lost 300 ships, but humanity had lost 200. The exchange rate favored the humans, which should have been impossible. Vexrith realized with cold clarity that he had underestimated his enemy. These humans were not the naive newcomers his scouts reported. They were dangerous. Aeon knew she could not sustain these losses much longer. Her fleet was being ground down through attrition. She gave the order she had prepared in advance. All human ships began a fighting retreat toward the asteroid belt. They moved in stages, with rear guard units covering the withdrawal, while the main fleet fell back. The Vrathan pursued, smelling victory. But the humans had spent 3 days preparing the asteroid belt for battle. Hidden among the rocks were thousands of mines, each one camouflaged to look like natural space debris. Automated defense platforms waited in powered-down mode, invisible to Vrathan sensors. As the alien fleet entered the belt, the traps activated. Mines detonated in sequence, creating chain reactions that destroyed dozens of Vrathan ships. Defense platforms came online and fired missiles from point-blank range before the Vrathan could respond. The asteroids themselves became weapons as human ships used them for cover and concealment. Vexrith realized too late that he was fighting in a prepared killing ground. He ordered his fleet to halt the pursuit and regroup. The first battle ended with both sides withdrawing to assess their losses and plan their next moves. On the Indomitable, Aeon studied the casualty reports. 200 ships lost. 15,000 crew members dead. The orbital defenses around Earth were damaged. The victory, if it could be called that, had cost dearly. But humanity had proven something important. They could hurt the Vrathan. They could make the aliens pay for every inch of space. Deho limped back to the defense, stationed with 12 of his original 30 fighters. His cockpit was scorched and his engines were failing. But he was alive. His crew was alive. And they had destroyed 5 carriers and dozens of smaller ships. The price was terrible, but the result was undeniable. On Earth, people watched the battle broadcasts in stunned silence. They saw their ships die. They saw the Vrathan power. But they also saw something that filled them with desperate hope. They saw humanity fighting back. They saw the aliens bleeding. They saw that this war was not over before it began. President Ji Woo addressed the planet again. She did not sugarcoat the losses. She honored the dead and acknowledged the pain of their sacrifice. But she also celebrated what had been achieved. Humanity had stood against impossible odds and survived. They had faced the Vrathan military and inflicted losses the aliens never expected. General Tae soon began mobilizing reserves. If the Vrathan could lose 300 ships in a single battle, then this war might last longer than anyone predicted. Humanity needed more ships, more weapons, more soldiers. They needed to turn their entire civilization into a war machine. The Vrathan fleet regrouped beyond Mars, licking their wounds and planning their next assault. Vexrith reported to the Vrathan Council, explaining the unexpected resistance. Some council members suggested increasing the fleet to 10,000 ships. Others suggested simply bombarding Earth from orbit and being done with it, but Vexrith refused both suggestions. Orbital bombardment would make humanity martyrs and inspire other species to resist. And bringing more ships would be admitting that the collective could not handle one primitive species. No, he would crush humanity with the forces he had. He would show the galaxy that resistance was futile, no matter how bravely fought. The first battle was over. The war had just begun. 6 months had passed since the first battle, and the war showed no signs of ending. The Vrathan had expected to conquer humanity in 2 weeks. Instead, they found themselves fighting across 24 star systems with no clear path to victory. High Commander Vexrith stared at the tactical displays in his command ship, struggling to understand how everything had gone so wrong. Humanity had abandoned conventional warfare completely. They no longer met the Vrathan fleet in open battle. Instead, they struck from shadows and vanished before reinforcements could arrive. Every Vrathan supply convoy needed heavy escort. Every occupied planet required massive garrison forces. Every star system the Vrathan controlled became a drain on resources rather than a source of strength. Colonel J. Juan Park commanded the Special Operations unit known as Ghost Company. His team specialized in boarding actions and sabotage. They moved in small, fast ships that could slip past Vrathan sensors. They wore stolen Vrathan uniforms and carried forged identification. They spoke the alien language and knew their protocols. When Ghost Company struck, the Vrathan never saw them coming. Jaehoan's latest mission targeted a Vrathan supply depot in the Kepler system. The depot contained fuel, ammunition, and spare parts for 3 Vrathan battle groups. It was heavily defended with automated turrets and shield generators. A conventional assault would cost hundreds of lives and probably fail. So Jaehoan did not assault it conventionally. His team arrived in a captured Vrathan cargo ship, broadcasting proper clearance codes and following standard approach procedures. The depot controllers saw nothing unusual. Cargo ships came and went constantly. This one looked legitimate. They granted docking permission without a second thought. 20 human soldiers emerged from the cargo hold, moving quickly through the depot corridors. They planted explosives at critical junction points, targeting fuel lines and ammunition stores. The charges were small and carefully placed to create maximum destruction through chain reactions. Within 15 minutes, Ghost Company was back on their ship and departing the depot. The explosions started 3 minutes after they cleared the docking bay. The fuel ignited first, creating a fireball that consumed half the depot. Secondary explosions followed as ammunition stores detonated. The shield generators failed, and the entire structure began to break apart. By the time Vrathan reinforcements arrived, the depot was nothing but floating wreckage. Ji-Wan reported the successful mission and immediately began planning the next one. There were always more targets. The Vrathan logistics network stretched across hundreds of systems. Every depot destroyed meant ships without fuel. Every convoy ambushed meant soldiers without ammunition. Humanity could not match the Vrathan in open warfare, but they could bleed them through 1,000 small cuts. On the colony world of New Bizan, civilian resistance leader Yoon Ji-sung coordinated guerrilla fighters against Vrathan occupation forces. The aliens had conquered the planet 3 months earlier, expecting the population to submit peacefully. Instead, they found themselves fighting an invisible enemy that struck without warning and melted back into the civilian population. EU Unji had been a teacher before the war. She taught history and politics at the Colonial University. When the Vrathan came, she organized her students into resistance cells. They used their knowledge of the planet to set traps and ambushes. They sabotaged Vrathan equipment and assassinated collaborators. They made it impossible for the aliens to maintain control. The Vrathan response was brutal. They executed suspected resistance members and imposed strict curfews. They razed entire neighborhoods suspected of harboring fighters. But every harsh measure only created more resistance. Every execution made more enemies. Yoonji's network grew stronger, even as the Vrathan increased the security measures. She led a raid on a Vrathan command post, using smuggled explosives to destroy the building and kill the garrison commander. The attack cost 5 resistance fighters their lives, but it sent a clear message. New Bizan would never accept occupation. The Vrathan could kill every human on the planet, but they could not make the survivors obey. Back on Earth, the scientific community worked frantically to close the technology gap. Dr. Hyun Woo Kong led a team studying captured Vrathan equipment. They had salvaged shield generators, weapon systems, and computer cores from destroyed enemy ships. Now they needed to understand how these technologies worked and adapt them. For human use, Hyun Woo discovered that Vrathan shields operated on rotating frequency patterns to deflect energy weapons. By mapping these patterns, human weapons could be calibrated to punch through the shields at vulnerable moments. It required precise timing and complex calculations, but it worked. Human ships equipped with the new targeting systems could damage. Vrathan vessels that previously seemed invulnerable. Dr. Bo Ryun took a different approach. She studied Vrathan biology, looking for weaknesses that could be exploited. The aliens had a different biochemistry than humans, which meant they were vulnerable to different toxins. Bo Ra developed a biological agent that attacked Vrathan respiratory systems without harming humans or other species. It was a weapon of last resort, illegal under human law. But President Ji Woo authorized its production anyway. In total war, morality became a luxury humanity could not afford. The strategic situation shifted dramatically when Commander Young Sik Nam proposed a daring raid on the Vrathan shipyard at Proxima. The shipyard produced 50 new warships every month, replacing Vrathan losses and maintaining their numerical advantage. If the shipyard could be destroyed, it would cripple Vrathan military production for years. The raid would be suicide. The shipyard was protected by 300 ships and multiple defense platforms. Any attacking force would be detected long before it reached the target. A conventional assault was impossible. Young Sik did not plan a conventional assault. He gathered a fleet of 60 ships, all of them older models scheduled for decommission. The ships were heavily modified, their weapons removed, and their engines enhanced. Their crews were volunteers who understood they would not survive the mission. These were not warships anymore. They were guided missiles with human pilots. The fleet jumped into the Proxima system and immediately accelerated to maximum speed. Vrathan defenders opened fire, destroying ship after ship. But the human vessels did not slow down or try to fight back. They simply drove forward with single-minded purpose. Their target was the shipyard itself. Young Sik's ship was one of the last to survive the defensive fire. His hull was breached in 3 places. His engines were failing, but he was close enough. He aimed his ship at the shipyard's fusion core and locked the controls. Then he and his crew evacuated in escape pods, knowing the Vrathan would likely capture them. The ship struck the shipyard at incredible speed, penetrating deep into its structure before exploding. The fusion core went critical, and the entire shipyard detonated in a blast visible from orbit. 50 warships under construction were destroyed. The construction facilities were obliterated. The Vrathan lost years of production capacity in seconds. Young Sik and 30 other survivors were captured by the Vrathan. They expected torture and execution. Instead, they became propaganda tools for Earth. President Ji Woo broadcast their sacrifice to the galaxy, showing that humans were willing to die for freedom. The message resonated across species that lived under Vrathan rule. If humans could resist, maybe others could too. The Vrathan Council grew increasingly frustrated with Vexrith. He had promised a quick victory. Instead, the war was draining their economy and weakening their grip on other territories. Subject species were becoming restless. Some openly questioned whether the collective was as invincible as they claimed. Vexrith argued that victory was still achievable. Humanity was losing population and resources. Their colonies were falling one by one. Yes, the humans fought with unexpected ferocity, but they were still being ground down through attrition. Give him more time and more resources, and he would finish this war. But some council members suggested a different approach. Perhaps negotiation was possible. Perhaps humanity could be offered some form of limited autonomy in exchange for ending the resistance. The war was costing too much for what was supposed to be a minor conquest. These suggestions enraged Vexrith. The collective did not negotiate with inferiors. They did not compromise with rebels. To even suggest peace would show weakness and invite more rebellions. No, humanity must be crushed completely to maintain the collective's reputation for invincibility. On Earth, President Chi Wu received reports from Ambassador Hannah Park. She had spent months building diplomatic relationships with species that were neutral or secretly opposed to the Vrathan. These species could not openly support humanity without inviting Vrathan retaliation, but they could provide intelligence, resources, and safe harbors for human ships. Hannah had assembled a coalition of 43 species willing to help humanity in secret. It was not an alliance, not officially, but it was enough. Medical supplies reached human colonies through neutral shipping. Intelligence about Vrathan fleet movements found its way to Earth Military Command. Damaged human ships found refuge in systems that claimed neutrality while quietly aiding the resistance. The galaxy was watching humanity struggle, and many were inspired by what they saw. The Vrathan seemed invincible, but humans were proving that determination could overcome power. Every month the war continued. More species began to question whether they too could resist. 6 months into the war, neither side had achieved decisive victory. But the strategic situation had fundamentally changed. The Vrathan were no longer fighting to conquer humanity. They were fighting to prove they could still win. And humanity was no longer fighting for survival. They were fighting to win. 2 years into the war, Admiral Yian Lai stood before a holographic display showing 8 star systems simultaneously. Her fleet had grown to 1,200 ships, incorporating captured Vrathan technology and revolutionary human innovations. Operation Thunderbreak was about to begin, and it would either turn the tide of the war or end. In catastrophic defeat, the operation was ambitious, beyond anything humanity had attempted. 8 separate battle groups would strike at Vrathan positions across the frontier at exactly the same moment. The Vrathan would be forced to divide their attention and resources, unable to concentrate their superior numbers against any single target. If executed perfectly, humanity would capture critical systems and shift the strategic balance. If anything went wrong, 8 fleets would be destroyed simultaneously. Yian had spent months planning every detail. She knew the Vrathan expected human raids and guerrilla attacks. They did not expect a coordinated offensive across such a wide front. The surprise would be devastating, but only if every battle group hit their targets within the same hour. Timing was everything. Captain Dae-ho Kim commanded Battle Group Phoenix, assigned to assault the Vrathan forward base in the Kepler system. His flagship was the captured Vrathan dreadnought Defiance, refitted with human weapons and crewed by survivors from dozens of destroyed ships. Dae-ho had died and been revived twice during the war. His body bore scars from burns and shrapnel, but his mind remained sharp and his determination unshaken. His fleet included 30 warships and 50 support vessels. They would face 3 times as many Vrathan defenders. The odds were terrible, but humanity had learned to fight despite the odds. Dae-ho gathered his captains for final instructions. Every officer knew their role. Every crew was ready. They jumped into hyperspace together, racing toward their destiny. The Vrathan base detected the human fleet the moment they emerged from hyperspace. Alarms blared across the station as defenders scrambled to battle stations. But before they could form a proper defensive line, something impossible happened. The human ships vanished. Scientist Sang-Hoo Lim had developed micro-jump technology, allowing ships to make very short hyperspace jumps during combat. The jumps only covered a few thousand kilometers and consumed enormous energy. But they allowed human ships to appear and disappear in battle, striking from unexpected angles and evading counterfire. The Vrathan had nothing like it. Battle Group Phoenix materialized inside the defensive perimeter, already firing. Dae-ho's dreadnought targeted the station's shield generators, while smaller ships engaged Vrathan warships. The enemy tried to adapt, but how do you fight an enemy that can teleport? Human ships would fire, jump away before return fire arrived, and reappear somewhere else and fire again. The battle became chaos. Vrathan ships fired at positions where human vessels had been seconds earlier. Their formations dissolved as they tried to track enemies that refused to stay in one place. Daiho pressed his advantage, using the confusion to destroy one Vrathan ship after another. Wing Commander Hai Jin-Ru led fighter squadrons that devastated Vrathan capital ships using swarm tactics. Her pilots flew in coordinated groups, each fighter covering the others. They struck at engines and weapon systems, crippling ships without destroying them. Disabled vessels became obstacles that blocked Vrathan formations and created more chaos. Hai-Jin's personal fighter took heavy damage during a strafing run against a Vrathan cruiser. Her cockpit filled with smoke and her controls sparked. She could have ejected and hoped for rescue. Instead, she redirected all power to engines and rammed her damaged fighter into the cruiser's bridge. The impact killed her instantly and decapitated the Vrathan command structure. Her squadron avenged her death by destroying every escort ship in the area. Kang Su-Beek led marine units that boarded and captured a Vrathan dreadnought intact. His soldiers fought deck by deck, using their knowledge of captured Vrathan ships to anticipate enemy positions. The fighting was brutal and close quarters. Kyung-Soo lost half his marines, but the survivors took control of the ship and its valuable computer systems. The intelligence gained from the captured dreadnought was priceless. Vrathan fleet movements, military codes, strategic plans. All of it fell into human hands. Admiral Yeon now knew where every major Vrathan fleet was positioned and what their orders were. The captured ship became Earth's new flagship, a symbol that humanity could not only resist the Vrathan, but capture their greatest weapons. Across 7 other systems, similar battles raged. Not every engagement went as well as Kepler. Battle Group Lion lost half its ships, taking a Vrathan supply hub. Battle Group Dragon retreated after encountering unexpected reinforcements. But 5 of the 8 objectives were captured, and the Vrathan were reeling from the coordinated assault. High Commander Vexrith stared at the disaster unfolding across his command displays. He had lost 30 systems in a single day. His forward bases were burning. His supply lines were cut. The humans had gone from guerrilla resistance to strategic offensive, and his forces were not ready for the transition. Worse, the political situation was deteriorating. Several species that the Vrathan had conquered decades ago saw humanity's offensive and launched their own rebellions. The collective suddenly faced insurgencies across their empire. Vexrith needed to crush these rebellions quickly before they spread, but he also needed to stop the human advance. He did not have enough forces for both. The Vrathan Council removed Vexrith from command. They blamed him for underestimating humanity and mishandling the war. His replacement, War Marshal Vexner, was a hardliner who believed in total annihilation. If humanity would not surrender, then humanity would be exterminated. Every colony would be sterilized. Every ship would be hunted down. Earth itself would be reduced to a lifeless rock. Vexner began with New Sol Colony, home to 3 million civilians. He ordered his fleet to bombard the planet from orbit without warning. The attack lasted 3 hours. When it ended, New Sol was a burning wasteland. No buildings stood. No forests remained. The cities were craters. The oceans were poisoned. Everyone died. News of the massacre reached Earth within hours. The reaction was immediate and volcanic. Humanity's resolve, already strong, became absolute. Every civilian who had been uncertain about the war now demanded vengeance. Every soldier who had fought with restraint now fought with fury. Vexner had intended to terrify humanity into submission. Instead, he had guaranteed that no peace was possible until one side was utterly defeated. President Ji Woo addressed the planet with tears streaming down her face. She spoke of the children who died on New Sol, the families erased, the lives stolen. She promised that humanity would never forgive this atrocity and never stop fighting until justice was achieved. The speech was broadcast across the galaxy, and neutral species who had avoided involvement now condemned the Vrathan openly. Ambassador Hannah Park leveraged the massacre to build a true military alliance. Species that had provided quiet support now signed formal treaties with Earth. They contributed ships, weapons, and soldiers to the human cause. The war was no longer humanity against the Vrathan. It was freedom against tyranny, and dozens of species chose freedom. The coalition grew to include warriors from 43 different species, all united by opposition to Vrathan brutality. They brought diverse tactics and technologies that complemented human warfare. Some species provided stealth technology. Others offered medical advancements that saved countless lives. Together, they formed an alliance that could match the Vrathan militarily. General Tae-Soo Lee coordinated training programs that integrated coalition forces with human military units. The cultural differences were enormous, but everyone shared a common goal. Vrathan officers who had defected provided intelligence about enemy weaknesses. Scientists from multiple species collaborated on weapons development. The coalition became more than the sum of its parts. Vexner responded to the alliance by escalating the war further. He ordered Vrathan forces to target civilian populations in coalition territory. His ships bombarded worlds that had joined humanity's cause, killing billions. Each atrocity strengthened the coalition's resolve and turned more neutral species against the collective. The Vrathan collective was collapsing from within. Their economy strained under the cost of fighting multiple wars simultaneously. Their population questioned why so many soldiers were dying for a conquest that brought only more enemies. Their subject species rebelled openly, knowing that defeat was possible if enough species stood together. Vex Riff, stripped of command but still influential, watched the disaster unfold. He had warned the Council that destroying New Sol would backfire. He had argued against Vexnera's appointment, knowing the fanatic would drive more species into humanity's arms. Now he quietly gathered reformist officers who believed the collective needed to change or die. Admiral Yeon Lai prepared for the final phase of the war. The coalition now fielded 2,500 warships against the Vrathan's remaining 4,000. The numbers still favored the enemy, but the gap was closing. More importantly, the Vrathan were fighting on multiple fronts while the coalition focused on a single strategic objective. The target was Vrathnus Prime, the Vrathan homeworld. If the capital fell, the war would end. Every Vrathan military force would lose coordination. Every subject species would see that the collective could be defeated. The entire empire would fracture. Operation Final Dawn was scheduled to begin in 1 month. 2,500 ships would jump to the Vrathan home system and fight the decisive battle of the war. Millions of soldiers would either return as liberators or die trying. There would be no retreat and no second chances. The galaxy held its breath and waited to see if humanity's impossible rebellion would end in victory or extinction. The coalition fleet assembled at the edge of Vrathan space. 2,500 warships from 43 different species. Fleet Admiral Yeon Lei stood on the bridge of a captured dreadnought Defiance, now Earth's flagship, and reviewed the final battle plans. This was humanity's 3rd year of war, and it would end today one way or another. The Vrathan had committed their remaining 4,000 ships to defending their homeworld. War Marshal Vexner commanded the defense personally, determined to slaughter the coalition fleet and prove the collective superiority. He had fortified the system with defense stations, minefields, and automated weapons platforms. The battle would be the largest naval engagement in galactic history. Captain Dae-ho Kim commanded the first wave, 1,000 ships designated as the Hammer Force. Their mission was to punch through the outer defenses and create an opening for the main fleet. Dae-ho knew most of his ships would not survive, but survival was not the objective. Victory was the objective, regardless of cost. The Coalition fleet jumped into the Vrathan system at multiple entry points simultaneously, forcing the defenders to split their attention. Dexnura's forces responded with overwhelming firepower, destroying Coalition ships by the dozen. But for every ship that died, 2 more pushed forward. The Coalition advance was relentless. Dae-ho's dreadnought took heavy fire immediately. His shields failed within minutes. His armor was breached in 7 places. Half his crew died in the first hour. But he kept pushing forward, using his dying ship as a battering ram against the Vrathan defensive line. His weapons fired until they overheated and exploded. His engines burned until they melted, the Vrathan defense station targeting. His ship charged its main weapon for a killing shot. Dae-ho diverted all remaining power to forward momentum and aimed directly at the station. He ordered his surviving crew to evacuate while he locked himself on the bridge. The last thing he saw was the station growing larger in his view screen before the Defiance struck at incredible speed. The impact was catastrophic. The dreadnought's fusion core detonated, taking the defense station and 30 Vrathan ships with it. The explosion created a gap in the defensive line wide enough for the Coalition main fleet to exploit. Dae-ho died instantly, but his sacrifice achieved what conventional tactics could not. The hammer had shattered the shield. Admiral Yeon led the main fleet through the gap, engaging Vrathan forces in close combat where numerical superiority mattered less. Coalition ships were more diverse in design and capability, creating tactical unpredictability. Human vessels used micro-jump technology to teleport around the battlefield. Alien allies provided support with weapons the Vrathan had never encountered. The battle raged for 6 days across the entire star system. Ships died by the hundreds on both sides. Debris fields grew so large they became navigation hazards. Entire squadrons were wiped out in minutes. The space around Vrathanos Prime became a graveyard of twisted metal and frozen bodies. Wing Commander Hai-Jin Ryu had died 2 years earlier, but her legacy lived on in the fighter pilots who followed her tactics. They struck in coordinated swarms, overwhelming Vrathan point defenses through sheer numbers. Each pilot knew they might die at any moment, but they flew anyway because billions of lives depended on their courage. General Tae-Soon Lee commanded the ground invasion force waiting in orbit. He watched the naval battle and prepared his Marines for the assault on the planet's surface. If the fleet could establish orbital superiority, his soldiers would drop onto Vrathanos Prime and fight building by building through the capital city. It would be bloody work, but someone had to do it. On the 6th day of battle, the Vrathan defensive line finally collapsed. Too many ships destroyed. Too many commanders killed. Too much coordination lost. The Coalition fleet achieved orbital superiority, and Tae-Soon gave the order to begin the invasion. Dropships carried Marines through the atmosphere, while orbital bombardment softened. Key defensive positions. Tae-Soon led from the front, fighting alongside his soldiers in the streets of the Vrathan capital. The enemy fought with desperate fury, knowing their civilization was at stake. Every building became a fortress. Every street became a battlefield. The Marines advanced block by block, paying in blood for every meter of ground. War Marshal Vex refused to accept defeat. He activated a secret weapon built beneath the planet's surface, a massive bomb designed to crack the planetary core. If he could not win, he would destroy everything. The entire planet would die, taking the Coalition fleet with it. In his mind, mutual annihilation was preferable to surrender, but Vexrith, the former commander who had started this war, had been watching and waiting. He had gathered reformist officers who were horrified by Vexner's genocidal tactics. They had watched billions die for a war that served no purpose beyond pride. They had seen the collective's empire crumble because of one fanatic's refusal to accept reality. Vexrith confronted Vexner in the war room deep beneath the capital. The war marshal was about to activate the planetary weapon when Vexrith entered with 20 armed officers. They demanded Vexner stand down and surrender to the Coalition. Vexner refused, calling them traitors and cowards. The confrontation ended with violence. Vexrith shot Vexner personally, preventing him from destroying the planet. The other reformist officers secured the war room and deactivated the doomsday weapon. Then Vexrith opened communications with the Coalition fleet and offered unconditional surrender. Admiral Yan received the surrender notification with cautious relief. She verified that Vrathan forces were standing down across the system. The shooting gradually stopped as both sides realized the war was ending. After 3 years of brutal combat, sudden silence felt surreal. Ambassador Hannah Park arrived on Vrathan's Prime to negotiate the final peace terms. She met with Vexrith in the ruins of the Vrathan Council building. The alien who had once demanded humanity's surrender now knelt before a human diplomat and accepted defeat. The irony was not lost on either of them. The treaty was harsh but fair. The Vrathan collective would be dissolved immediately. All subject species would be granted independence. Vrathan military forces would be reduced to defensive militia only. War criminals would face trial, including Vexrith himself for his role in starting the war. But the Vrathan people would not be exterminated or enslaved. They would be given a chance to rebuild as a peaceful society. The galaxy watched as humanity demonstrated that victory did not require vengeance. They could have destroyed Vrathinos Prime. They could have enslaved the Vrathan as the Vrathan had enslaved others. But they chose a different path. Showing that strength included Mercy. President Ji Woo Choi returned to Earth for a memorial service at the Monument of Heroes. The monument was a massive wall, inscribed with the names of every human who died in the war. 18 million names carved in stone, representing 18 million lives stolen by conflict. Ji Woo stood before the wall and wept for them all. The names included soldiers and civilians, famous heroes and unknown victims. Dae-ho Kim, who sacrificed his ship to break the Vrathan defenses. Hai-Jin-Roo, who died ramming her fighter into an enemy cruiser. Young Seat-Nam, who destroyed the shipyard and was captured. Yoon Ji-song, who led resistance fighters on New Bizan until the Vrathan killed her. 3 million souls who died when Vexner bombarded. New Seoul. Ji Woo's speech was broadcast to every human settlement and translated for the entire galaxy. She spoke of the cost of freedom and the price of resistance. She honored those who died and those who survived. She acknowledged that victory felt hollow and so many would never see it. But she also affirmed that their sacrifice mattered because humanity was still free. The war had transformed humanity from naive newcomers to a formidable power. Other species now treated Earth with respect and even fear. Humanity had proven that determination could overcome superior technology, that courage could defeat overwhelming numbers, that a species willing to fight to the last would never be conquered. But the transformation came at terrible cost. Entire colonies destroyed, millions dead, economies ruined, families torn apart. The psychological scars would last for generations. Children grew up without parents. Parents buried children. The price of freedom had been paid in blood and tears. Vexrith approached Hannah privately after the treaty signing. He had been processing everything that happened since he first arrived at Earth's defense station 3 years earlier. He had expected primitive beings who would surrender immediately. Instead, he found warriors who fought with a ferocity that shocked the galaxy. He asked Hannah the question that haunted him. Why did humans fight so desperately when surrender would have saved millions of lives? Why choose death over submission? Most species eventually accepted that survival required compromise. But humanity never compromised. They fought until they won, or until they died. Hannah looked at the monument of heroes visible through the window. She thought about Daeho and Haijin, and all the others whose names were carved in stone. She thought about the choice humanity made when given 72 hours to surrender. She thought about what freedom meant, and why some things were worth dying for. Her answer was simple and absolute. Because some things are worth dying for. Freedom is one of them. Dignity is another. The right to control your own destiny matters more than survival as slaves. Humans understood this instinctively. They would rather die free than live in chains. That was something the Vrathan had forgotten during their centuries of conquest. Vexrith listened and finally understood. The collective had grown powerful by conquering weaker species. But they had lost something essential in the process. They had forgotten that the will to be free was stronger than the desire to rule. They had forgotten that pride and determination could overcome material advantage. They had forgotten what made civilizations worth preserving. The war was over, but its effects would echo for centuries. Dozens of species had gained independence from the Vrathan. New alliances formed based on mutual respect rather than domination. The balance of power in the galaxy shifted fundamentally. And at the center of this new order stood humanity, battered but unbroken. Earth began the long process of rebuilding. Colonies were reconstructed. Ships were repaired. Economies recovered. But the memory of the war would never fade. Every human knew the price that had been paid. Every human understood that freedom was not free. The galaxy would never again make the mistake of demanding humanity's surrender. The legend of the human war spread across thousands of worlds, a story of impossible victory against overwhelming odds. It became a symbol of hope for oppressed peoples everywhere, and a warning to would-be conquerors. Humanity had ignited a legendary war and emerged victorious. But the victory belonged not to weapons or tactics. It belonged to the indomitable human spirit that refused to surrender even when surrender seemed like the only rational choice. That spirit would define humanity's place in the galaxy for millennia to come.